When I was in high school, I was a awful reader. If it didn't have superheroes or wasn't about music or music theory or the music industry in some way, I probably wasn't going to read it. From about ninth to 11th grade, I was just as likely to look up Cliff's Notes or try to find a film adaptation for an assigned book just so I could get through the quizzes and tests and essays. But around 12th grade, thanks to an amazing teacher, thank you, Ms. Fedorovich, and our English literature class that she taught, I began to get a little bit more into books, particularly those of Jane Austen, and I was a really big fan of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. But after high school, I fell off the reading train again, I'm sad to admit, and I didn't really become a healthy reader again until I was in my 30s, and didn't really dive more into prose until my late 30s. And so that left this big gap of American literature that I had left just completely unread. And there were so many classics that I was just culturally unaware of. I don't think that's all that unusual for most of the American public, especially men who I think are not typically as well read as our female counterparts. But I've been trying to close that gap just a little bit every year. And this past week, I closed a big one when I read for the very first time in 2025 as a 41-year-old man, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, there are a couple reasons I read this book. One, my girlfriend is a huge fan of it and has told me over and over again that I should read it, especially as a fan of Haruki Murakami, given that he was a core and key influence on Murakami's writing. But you may also recall that a few weeks ago in my 2025 reading resolutions video, the very first resolution was that I would be creating a monthly reading calendar centered on the feelings of the month, the atmosphere of the given month, and any holidays that might fall within. And for January, I chose The Great Gatsby. Some of it was kind of mostly an externalized view of the book as someone who hadn't read it. I just saw it as a book with a story with a lot of glitter and champagne and bubbly and good times in the jazz age. But as I began to read more and more, that general sense of reinvention that one associates with the beginning of a new year was very prevalent in this book. And suddenly I realized that this was a perfectly appropriate book for the season, and I couldn't have found a better start for my New Year's reading calendar. Before I dive any further into my thoughts around The Great Gatsby and this classic of American literature, let's just do a very quick and brief overview of the plot of The Great Gatsby. Not that you need it, but just in case you need the refresher, here it is in a very condensed form. The Great Gatsby follows our narrator Nick Carraway during the summer of 1922 as he moves to New York and becomes entangled in the life of his mysterious millionaire neighbor, Jay Gatsby. Nick's cousin Daisy lives across the bay with her wealthy husband Tom Buchanan, and we soon learn that Gatsby shares a romantic history with her from before she married. Gatsby's enormous mansion, his lavish parties, and his entire carefully constructed life all serve one purpose: to win back Daisy's love. Through Nick's help, Gatsby reunites with Daisy, rekindling their relationship, but their affair becomes increasingly complicated by Tom's suspicions, his own infidelity, and the stark differences between old money and new money in 1920s high society. Upon starting the book, I struggled. I don't know how to best describe this other than it felt a bit like a return of the old feeling when you get assigned a book and you don't want to read it. That's kind of what happened to me in the first, I'd say about 20 pages of reading The Great Gatsby. I don't know why that is. I guess there's just something to be said for if a book is considered like assignment reading, it feels like an assignment. And it's strange because I've read books that are far more complex and far more difficult. This really is not a difficult book to read at all, but I still struggled with staying on task with the book and paying attention and not wondering what's on my phone and wondering what the dogs are up to and all of these other things. I just couldn't get engaged at first. And so at a certain point, I put the paperback down and decided to try digitally, because I did find at some point, so with some books, I can read on my Kindle better than I can physically. I don't know why that is, but I guess there's just something about the clicking through, having just like those words specifically in front of you, that kind of captured feeling. You can just do it a lot faster and you're able to get through a lot of reading a lot quicker. I think that's kind of a typical reading tip that a lot of people give anyway, but I found that was the case for me. So with Gatsby being in the public domain, I went to the Empowered Project, which is probably one of the best places to get public domain works, totally scot-free with really good copy editing because there's just so many junky versions of The Great Gatsby floating around in the Kindle store. And I began reading that way and I was on board much quicker. I'll also say that I think the turn in that book happens right around the time that Nick first meets Gatsby. Before then, there's some interesting historical context, some okay observations about Long Island and the two different eggs, and sort of the general topography and atmosphere and dynamics of the upper crust of New York society, but it's kind of draggy, especially in those initial conversations between Daisy and Nick and Tom. But once you get to that first party and Nick is enraptured by Gatsby and he kind of sees this kind of litany of people all around him, that not only does the book seem to come alive, but also some of the weirder elements of the book come to the fore. Like, for example, the guy who just lives at Gatsby's house and plays piano, who we never really see again. Or when Gatsby takes Nick and Jordan, who is Nick's paramour, to his room and they start just going through all his clothes and he's just like throwing them all around. It has this vividness that I think the earlier parts of the book lack, and maybe that's by design, but I think that that's something that's very notable, that the moment Gatsby comes aboard, a spell is kind of cast over the reader as well as Nick. And once I got sort of tied into the book at that point, I began to sort of lock into some of the things that really stuck with me about the book. Number one, this is where I kind of zeroed in on where a lot of pop culture references come from that I just was not aware of, had their origin in The Great Gatsby. Most notably, of course, someone like Don Draper from Mad Men, who is his own sort of made man in a very similar way to Jay Gatsby, coming from sort of similar humble origins and completely redefining himself. But the American dream also fails them to a degree. And I think that's kind of the sort of tragic note about The Great Gatsby that I really appreciated, but also found very haunting, particularly as sort of the more funereal dirge of the third act and the final pages come to the fore. I think the other element about this book that really sticks out to me is the self-insert of Fitzgerald, both within Nick and within Gatsby. So Gatsby, I think, is a little more obvious as far as, like, if you know the broad strokes of Fitzgerald's life and his relationship with Zelda, you understand that a lot of the dynamics between Gatsby and Daisy are pulled pretty much directly from Fitzgerald's life, even to the point where there's, like, I think there's a specific quote where Daisy refers to her daughter as a beautiful little fool. And that is something that Zelda specifically said about their own daughter, which I think that's not uncommon for authors to pull from their lives, but to do so in such a direct, kind of overstated way, I think that underscores the fact that this is their relationship put to page. And I think the more we know about the difficult dynamics that existed between the two of them, we come to understand that even further. On the other hand, the Nick side of things is a little more, or are a little more subtle. We know that F. Scott Fitzgerald was a adventurous fellow sexually. And that, I think, is a part of what informs Nick's character, both subtly and not so subtly. So, for example, Nick's fascinating because he is probably the most plotless narrator or audience POV character I can think of. So, he very little of the plot actually occurs because of him. I think if Nick wasn't in the story would continue without him. Gatsby moves to West Egg. Gatsby would have still likely reunited with Daisy at some point. And so much of the plot in terms of what Tom does, what Daisy does, the tragedy that unfolds later in the book, it all happens really without Nick being involved in any way. He's just along for the ride in almost every aspect. To that degree, he is Fitzgerald's observer in the story who's almost omniscient, except for the fact that he also underscores some of Fitzgerald's own interests as far as maybe his own interest in men. I think that's kind of the implicit part of the book that needs to be discussed more because, for example, when Nick leaves a party with that one artist, and then later, very quickly, they're basically in this artist's bedroom, and Nick's in his underwear, and there's just a lot of ellipses, and it becomes a question of what happened between the two of them. Did they have sex? Was there any sort of intimacy there at all? The book can't go there because it's a 1920s book and probably would have not been able to escape decency standards within the US. But on the other hand, what we know about Fitzgerald in his own personal life makes it seem more obvious that Nick could very well be, if not gay, at least queer. And on top of that, his relationships with women seem almost to be an afterthought, especially Jordan, who he just kind of doesn't really do anything with, kind of just ignores her, and then she leaves him. And that's kind of the course of their relationship, which isn't much of a course at all. So I feel like Nick, interestingly enough, is both a narrator and both a way for Fitzgerald to stretch the boundaries of what he's allowed to do with his characters. And I think that, in of itself, makes Nick worthwhile. And then lastly, one of the things that I've been wondering about, and this is just sort of a pet theory of mine, is did Daisy know what she was doing towards the end of the book when the crime is committed, or did she not? You know, there's this whole sequence where Daisy and Gatsby are in the car and they hit or run over the woman that Tom is having a relationship with. You know, if you read the book, you know this. Sorry, it's not a spoiler. I'm sure you guys already know what I'm talking about. But the book never really underlines whether or not Daisy is aware of her actions, whether she knew that she had hit Tom's lover or not. And my theory is that yes, she did. And that also kind of brings to bear that Scott has about Zelda. I don't know how to put this gently, but it might speak a little bit to Scott's implicit feelings about Zelda as someone who is capable of very vicious acts. That's not a very complimentary thing to say, and unfortunately Zelda had a very difficult life that I think she was born into a society that was not ready for her mostly, and I think she was treated very badly based on most of the historical record that I can find. But I also feel like Scott was probably not that fun to live with either, so the idea that he would present her stand-in in this way is not that surprising. Reading F. Scott Fitzgerald at 41 instead of 16, I'm not sure that it makes me want to read more Fitzgerald off the top of my head. I've got copies of Tender as the Night that my girlfriend bought years ago, as well as The Beautiful and the Damned, and I have them, so it's possible I might sit down and read them at some point. But it makes me more interested to dive deeper into his own literary circle, at least. One of the things that I started rabbit holing after I read this book was to get a sense of who else was in that circle beyond just Ernest Hemingway. And, you know, there's figures like John Dos Passos, there's Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, and a few others whose names I don't quite recall right now. And I wanted to almost kind of put together a little bit of a reading list of like, okay, well, this came out in like 1926. What else came out in 1926? And The Sun Also Rises was around the same time, as well as Manhattan Transfer and a few other works. So it's possible I might read some of those to get more of a flavor of the time, but I don't know that I'll necessarily read more Fitzgerald right away. Though I did like this book, it's just that I think the reputation of his earlier and later works really pale in comparison to Gatsby. But overall, The Great Gatsby, it's great. It is the great American novel? I don't know, but it's certainly very, very good. And I give it 4 stars. I'm happy to have finally read it. It was a long time coming. And yes, Hannah, you are absolutely right. I should have read it a long time ago, at least the first time you told me about it. So good job. All right, well, that's my January read. And I hope you all have gotten off to a great start on your monthly reading, and your reading goals are ambitious and exciting. And well, I look forward to hearing about what you've read. If you've read The Great Gatsby, though, let me know what you think about some of my goofball theories, and if you think I'm really off in any way. I would love to hear more about what you guys think about Nick, about his own perspective, some of the potential ramifications of his romantic interest and affair, and the whole self-insert piece of it all. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Let me know in the comments, and as always, like, comment, subscribe. Would love to hear more from you guys, and thank you so much for those of you who have already done so. We'll see you next time, and hey, keep reading.